Okay, and we are live. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining today. Today is our first, I would say, episode on the series of the history of St. Michael's, and we have a special person here who will share his thoughts, experiences about St. Michael and the history of the church and the culture and the people. So any questions at the end we can answer. So there are a few questions which I will move forward and stuff. So it's no secret. It is Uncle Paul, actually Israel Paul Raj. We welcome you, Uncle, and thank you very much for coming here and gathering with us to share your thoughts and experiences. Okay, let's start. So my first question, Uncle, to you before we speak about the church, I would like to ask you, can you just explain what was it like in Pulwat in the early days or the early environment in Pulwat? Would you like to just take us through that?
Yeah. See, what I'm sharing with you today is what I've learned from people who have gone before us and from the material available at St. Michael's, as well as in the diocesan archives. Now, about 200 years ago, Colombo was only a small town spread around the harbor. The richer folk lived on grounds in Mutwal, whilst the poorest segments of the society lived around Peta and St. Sebastian area. As need for housing grew, more people migrated toward Pulpit and Cinnamon Gardens. This included a group of Dobies. On the golf face area, there was a slope where this community lived. They used to wash the clothes and take it to their customers in the fort area in canoes. So you can imagine that in those days, there were no inhabitants in Pulwata. There was no roadways. People had to use the canoes in the canals that were available then. Have I answered that briefly, Manoj?
Yes, that's correct. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, you can, Uncle. Go ahead.
Okay. On the golf face area, there was a slope where this community of Dobies lived. They used to wash the clothes and take it to their customers in fort by canoes. Those in authority at that time needed the land occupied by them for a military hospital. The Dobie community were given alternate land towards the present Bear Lake, behind temple trees. Some of you would have seen the Dobies drying their clothes there. That is now a parking place for buses. This area was surrounded by coconut trees and cinnamon plants. That is how Pulwata and Cinnamon Gardens got their names. Some of these people would have been nominal Christians, as it was advantageous to profess the government religion under the Dutch rule at that time. Can I move on to start of the missionary work at that time, Manoj?
Yes. So the next one is, so I was just thinking of asking, so not sure if, everyone knew the earlier church wasn't a church. So maybe you slowly, build up on that history piece as well.
Okay. Now, it is not known exactly when missionary work began in Pulwata. It is, however, recorded that in 1844, a small part of a house had been set aside for Christian worship. Now, this is 77 years ago. They did not have a resident priest, and Reverend Solomon David, who was based in Kotavena, used to come to Pulwata to hold services. Sometime later, at his suggestion, Pulwata was separated from Kotavena and a catechist was stationed in Pulwata. This catechist worked under Reverend J. Thurston, a missionary from the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, SPG, UK missionary organization. Thurston Road in Colombo 7 was named after him. There are many roads in the vicinity of Pulwata which are named after great men of God. Boyd Place in Colombo 3 is named after Reverend Charles Twining Boyd. Glennie Street in Slave Island after Reverend Glennie. There are two Glennies according to diocesan records. There was Reverend J.M.S. Glennie and S.O. Glennie, both of whom had been archdeacons. In the beginning, worship in this small house church was in Sinhala. And when the numbers grew, the need for a regular place of worship was recognized. And so in 1852, that is 169 years ago, they started building a small chapel. And in 1853, Bishop Chapman, the first Bishop of Colombo, dedicated the first Pulpit chapel to St. Thomas. The actual location is the present junction of Hudson Road and Mohendram's Lane, just behind the present St. Margaret's Convent. It was a simple structure with half walls and a Kajan roof. The dedication of this chapel took place in 1853, which is almost 168 years ago. In 1864, the community in Pulwata decided to celebrate the anniversary of the dedication of their St. Thomas's Chapel in a fitting manner. Religious activities took a prominent place, and the grand finale was a grand fireworks display, which was a great attraction in the 1860s. The fireworks took place one night in August 1864, adjoining the chapel. It was an awe-inspiring phenomenon in those days. The congregation and the community around were present in large numbers, and so was Bishop Chapman, who had named the chapel after St. Thomas only a few years earlier. Everyone watched the sky rockets explode over their heads. Thousands of multicolored stars formed a canopy over the heads of spectators. Children shouted in joy. Men and women gaped open mouthed at this wonder. As the little artificial shells disappeared, the casing of a skyrocket, still smoldering, fell on the roof of the building behind the spectators. No one noticed this, as they were all interested in the next display. Skyrockets were exploding all over, and nobody noticed a whiff of a white smoke rising from the roof of the building behind them. Even when the white smoke gradually turned to a dark cloud and a tiny flickering flame appeared at its base, the people were too engrossed with the grand fireworks display. It was only when the whole place was suddenly lit up that the crowd turned to look at the unusual source of this very bright light. It was then too late, for the chapel of St. Thomas's Pulwata was on fire and was soon burnt down. It is said that Bishop Chapman was present right through this event, had tears in his eyes as he knelt in prayer. He consoled himself silently that God had a message by what had just happened, and that God will make everyone understand this message. Manoj, stop me if there is any question or
So just
interruption
a
as I
question.
go along.
So this was the first chapel of St. Thomas's, which was built and then got burned down.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
It is said that Bishop Chapman was present right through the event, had tears in his eyes as he knelt in prayer. He consoled himself silently that God had a message, what had just happened, and that God will make everyone understand this message. When the parishioners woke up next morning, which was a Sunday, they realized that they had no church to go to. So they prayed in their homes and talked about them among themselves. After some time, they decided that they had to build a new church. It was decided in the first place to abandon the old, cramped, and inadequate site where the burnt out chapel stood. About 200 yards away from this site, there was a coconut estate, and it was considered a suitable location for the church. And so this plot of land, which is the present site of the Church of St. Michael and All Angels, was purchased from the government. Work began on the new chapel, and it was completed in 1865.
Uncle, just to interrupt you a bit. So who gave leadership? Who gave leadership for this whole structure to or to develop this whole concept and stuff?
It is not recorded clearly as to A, B, or C who did it. But I think it's the group of the people jointly decided and moved forward. Obviously, Bishop Chapman would have given them some guidance at that time, particularly with regard to purchasing of the land from the government.
Yeah.
But no clear details are available about A, B, or C at Pulwata who would have been instrumental in it.
Yeah. And then the congregation-wise, was there 3 congregations? Was there 1 congregation at that time? Any records on those kind of things?
At that time, it was mainly Sinhala-oriented, and the worship was in Sinhala. And the people were predominantly Sinhalese-oriented. You see?
Okay. And also, sorry for asking so many questions. So the
go
people
on.
who were here in Polvat, what were they doing? I mean, what were they involved in? Were they helping in the ports? Were they helping in different other kinds of industries?
Predominantly, the Dobi community, but then there would have been others who were involved in minor work. No industry as such at that time. There was nothing which could have given employment. So obviously people would have been, involved in day-to-day work in that area. Anyway, Pulwata at that time was not habitated at all. So it would have been ordinary labor work at that time, predominantly. Then 2 years later, the chapel was enlarged and was dedicated to St. Thomas on his festival day, 21st December 1867, presided by Bishop Cotton, the second bishop. The service of dedication was in Sinhala. So you see, at that time, predominantly it was Sinhala. The official title then became St. Thomas's Chapel, Kollupitia. There was still no resident priest. There was our catechist who lived in the village, and he worked under the supervision of G.B. Vikramanayaka, who was the missionary in charge at that time. At that time, there were 30 communicants on the roll, and the total membership of the chapel was around 200, who were essentially Sinhalese. Services were held on Sundays at 9 a.m. and 6:30 p.m. Holy Eucharist was celebrated on the 3rd Sunday of the month. Village prayers were said in the church daily at 8 a.m. and evening prayer with Bible study was conducted at 7 p.m. on Wednesdays. Again, predominantly in Sinhalese. Around this time, Colombo was beginning to expand, and areas around Kollupitia and Cinnamon Gardens was gradually becoming a residential area. As residents in the chapel too grew, it became a convenient place to have services in English as well, instead of going all the way to St. Peter's Church in Fort. From the inception, services in the chapel was in Sinhalese, with an occasional service in English for the European residents close to the chapel. Europeans living in Kollupitia or Cinnamon Gardens had the choice of attending services in this chapel or to go all the way to St. Peter's Fort, the Cathedral, or Christchurch Golfes. The Ceylon Diocesan Gazette of 26th October 1892 said, but the cathedral could only be reached by a drive which only a very accommodating courtesy could describe as a Sabbath day's journey. St. Peter's was only about half the distance, but was still very much out of the way, while accommodation at Christchurch Golfes was exceedingly limited. Around this time, Archdeacon Matthew was transferred from St. Paul's Kandy to Colombo in 1886.
Uncle, I like to ask that question again. So why I've heard this Archdeacon Matthew being a very strong or with leadership character. So what was his involvement? Okay, he was Archdeacon, but what was his overall involvement in getting, I don't know, from the transformation from St. Thomas's Chapel to St. Michael's?
Yeah, I will come to that. You see, at around this time, Walter Edmund Matthew was transferred to from St. Paul's Church in Kandy to Colombo in 1886. In Colombo, he was placed in charge of the Colombo South District, which covered the churches in Galkisa, Milagiriya, Timbrigasaya, and Pulvata. As soon as Archdeacon settled down to work, he saw the possibility of developing this little chapel of St. Thomas into a more effective unit, which would also cater to the European community as well. The Ceylon Church News of 15th October 1887 says, at one time, there were thoughts of building a fine new church in the neighborhood of Cinnamon Gardens to take the place of St. Peter's, the position of which is fatal to its useful work among the civilian community in Colombo. Archdeacon Matthew was concerned about the growing European community in the city of Colombo and felt that St. Thomas's Chapel would be the best church to develop to cater to all the communities worshipping in and around this area. In this background, the Archdeacon decided to make use of the Pulvata Chapel for services in Sinhala as well as English. Thereafter, with the advice of the bishop, he quickly improved the chapel by cementing the floor, putting in windows and chairs for seating. There was also an extension of the west end with a more prominent west front. The elders at that time realized that this was not going to be a permanent building, and sooner or later, there had to be a much larger building to accommodate the expected increase in the congregation. The question then arose whether there should be a change of name. There was another older St. Thomas Church in Jinthapitiya, from which St. Thomas's College takes its name. By then, the Pulvata Chapel was becoming an important church, and it was considered not right to duplicate the name. It was then proposed to call the new church the Church of the Good Shepherd, and it was said that Archdeacon Matthew himself favored this name at the beginning, but eventually his decision was in favor of St. Michael's and All Angels. And so the St. Thomas's Church was dedicated to St. Michael's on 29 September 1887, 134 years ago, in the hope that the obedience and devotion of the holy angels might be imitated by all who worship in it.
So that means next year are we celebrating 135 or what?
You see, in June this year, it was the 100th years of the laying of the foundation stone. In 2020, next year, on 29th September, it will be 100 years of the present church building. All the worship started almost 170 years ago.
So that's a number everyone, I think, have to keep in mind next year.
I've already told the Board of Wardens about this, and that they should be ready when it comes to celebrating the centenary of the present building next year. Anyway, yes. At that service, there were 235 persons present at the service, which included Sir Arthur Gordon, the governor, and Sir E. Noel Walker, the lieutenant governor. The service was followed by matins with sermon by the bishop at 10 a.m. There was evensong in Portuguese at 3 p.m. and the proceedings concluded with evensong in English at 6 p.m. I want to read here a portion of the sermon preached by Archdeacon Matthew on September 1887. I have described what is the threefold purpose of our work: to effect the oneness of Christians in Christ, to maintain the constant worship of God, to be zealous in the ministration of souls of men and women. Here we shall teach the supreme importance of spiritual religion. Here, along with such teaching, we shall offer the constant supply of sacraments and ordinance of grace. Here will be some who will be tuned to choral worship, others who prefer a plain service, and the church will provide both. In the early days, St. Michael's was considered as a daughter church of St. Peter's Fort. The treasurer of St. Peter's Fort and St. Michael's was the same person, Mr. Atkin. In fact, the Warden's Minute Book of St. Peter's Fort, covering the period 1886 to 87, says that the collection on the 1st August was to be given for the enlargement of the Pulpit church. The complete separation of St. Michael's from St. Peter's took place in 1899 when two new parishes were formed: St. Paul's, Milagiriya, with the Church of the Good Shepherd, Timbrigasaya, and St. Michael's. In 1887, Archdeacon Matthew's visit to England, he persuaded the Mother Superior of St. Margaret's Convent to send a team of sisters to Sri Lanka. The story of St. Margaret's is another story in itself. In 1887, an important event took place when Reverend P.B. Munamala was appointed as the first resident priest for St. Michael's. He was the first Canadian to be ordained. With his appointment, an untiring effort soon saw numbers of the singular congregation increasing. It's worthy quoting Archdeacon Matthew's tribute to Reverend Munamala at this point. Though his special work was to be in the village of Pulwata, among the considerable population of nominal Christians living around the church, he was my helper in all the Sinhalese work. In my large district, and generally preached on Sunday at Galkissa or Milagiriya as well as St. Michael's. He threw himself heartily into evangelist work in the 12 schools in the district. In Pulwata village, he soon saw the only hope of winning the poor dhobies were to work hard all day, was to visit them in their houses at night and to teach them and pray with them, 3 or 4 together. Each night after evensong, he was engaged in this work till 9 or 10 at night. The results of it at once became manifest. The congregation rose from 40 or 50 to 100 or 120. And on the Sunday before the bishop left the diocese, no less than 175 were in church. Work in which I had almost despaired of seeing much fruit bloomed out at once under Peter Munamala's energy and devotion. The Reverend Munamala was succeeded by a lay worker, George Benjamin Ekanayaka, who later functioned as deacon and priest in St. Michael's for nearly 20 years. During this period, he was away in Cambridge for 4 years. It is said that he undoubtedly was one of the finest products of the Church of Ceylon as a priest, scholar, and theologian. The Reverend G.B. Ekanayaka, who was later a canon in the Church of Ceylon, was a remarkable man. He was concerned for the poor in Pulwata. He was shocked at the meager wages that the washerman of the Pulwata village was receiving, and he helped organize an industrial action, a strike in Pulwata. This is recorded by Dr. Kumari Jayawardena in a history of the labor movement in Sri Lanka.
So the first strike was initiated in Pulwata, is it?
That's right, and by a priest. St. Michael's has been involved in working with the poor ever since then. As a former vicar remarked, St. Michael should be increasingly known as the church of the poor and the church for the poor. You see, St. Michael's also had a diocesan school. Its early beginnings are not clear, but it goes back to the time of the first St. Thomas's Chapel in Pulpit. Archdeacon Matthew is reported to have transferred the school from its original location to some buildings adjoining the church. It was a vernacular school at first and later converted to an English school by Reverend G.B. Ekanayakar, who was the priest in charge of the singular congregation at St. Michael's. The school produced some of the finest boxers in our country over the years. The St. Michael's School used a part of the Matthew Hall as a classroom. With the school's takeover, church lost part of the hall. I'll come to that later.
So just to be clear, Uncle. So St. Michael's School actually started with the church becoming larger and bigger, and we ventured into helping more kids, poorer kids, or the village.
The Anglican Church in the early days established and ran a large number of schools all over the country. It is recorded that in the early days, there were over 400 schools in operation. Many of them were located in plantation areas. Missionary organizations like the CMS and the USPG established them, funded them, and ran them for many years. So this St. Michael's School was one of them, among the many. It is also reported that St. Michael's had a choir school in 1892-93. They had 8 scholars. They were provided free board, lodging, and education as choir scholars. Instruction was given in English, history, geography, arithmetic, music, Latin, algebra, and geometrical drawing. Now, no further details, unfortunately, as to its progress or closure is available. Unfortunately. Archdeacon Matthew was one of the leading figures in the history of the Church of Ceylon. We again quote from St. Michael's story of St. Michael's, published in 1887. Archdeacon Matthew was one of the leading figures in the history of the Church of Ceylon. His astonishing energy is well exemplified by what he did at St. Michael's. For in the short space of 2 years, he built a new church, imported an organ complete with organists from England, opened a choir school, and started regular services throughout the week, including a daily celebration of the Holy Communion. For many years, St. Michael's was the only church in Ceylon to have a daily celebration, and it has possessed that privilege without a break since that time. He was a great good man, very thoughtful and inspired, and loved by many schools. His winsome personality was a great organizer and wonderful parish priest. His love for Ceylon was profound, and he was an able lieutenant to Bishop Coxton. Now, Manoj, I did not realize that I also had some health issues. You know, I had 2 months ago went through a thyroidectomy operation and was gradually coming through that. And I now realize that my throat is giving some trouble. Okay. Are you in with me?
Yes, Uncle. You can take your breaks whenever you want.
Yeah. So,
so moving also, so as you know that maintaining such a church and a structure is not hard. I know there's a lot of people who are involved also in it. So the early church, how do you think that, who developed this whole concept? Who put their energy in building this whole thing, the concept, the open windows to the gutters to, I don't know, there's a lot of things, the domes and stuff. So there's a lot of thought process which has gone through. Who do you think would have, do you have anything in history mentioning such
you see,
things?
many of the priests of that time were responsible for it. As I go through, you will come across it. And when Archdeacon Matthew suddenly died in Talavakkale on 18 February 1889, That was a sad, big loss for church. Archdeacon Matthew was succeeded by Reverend Boyd, who was later an archdeacon. He's said to have lived in his own house, Uncliffe, in the strait named after him, Boyd Place. With the completion of the southwest breakwater in the Port of Colombo in 1895, made the Port of Colombo a vibrant and busy port. The growing population flowed into the empty land in Pulpit and Cinnamon Gardens. This movement speeded up further in 1903 when the first coal sheds were set up in Mundwall. This resulted in clouds of dust drifting inland and forced the well-to-do to move towards Pulpit.
So that means people moved from, I don't know, from maybe Mundwall, that area to Pulpit after that.
That's right. When the coal sheds were opened in Mundwall.
Okay.
Then, I'm cutting short a little. Huh?
Yes.
Then Archdeacon Reverend Henley retired in 1911 and he was succeeded by Reverend C.M. Ricketts as vicar in 1914. The English-speaking congregation was growing, and at a meeting of the congregation on 24th June 1918, it was decided that the Church of St. Michael's and All Angels, originally founded as St. Thomas, should be enlarged. Additional space were required for a suitable vestry for the clergy and the choir, room for a new organ, space for the school children to sit in the body of the church instead of in the lady chapel. However, it soon became clear that what was needed was a completely new church. And so plans were drawn up by Mr. Hubert Walker, who had been a long-standing worshipper at St. Michael's. Work began on the new building soon thereafter, and a memorial stone was laid in the wall of the West End by Mr. L.O. Leaf, the vicar's warden, on 27 June 1920, which was just 100 years ago last June. The following year, the sanctuary, the chapel, Lady Chapel, the transept had been completed. This first part of the new church was consecrated by Bishop P.A. Coppleston on Sunday, 27 September 1921. At evensong that evening, Pastor Ricketts preached a stirring sermon when he dealt with the past and the future of St. Michael's. He spoke of the great work of St. Michael's was performing in bringing to the worship of Christians of so many races and of such different traditions. Soon thereafter, the nave was added to the new building. This was paid for by Mr. T.L. Villiers as an appreciation for all that St. Michael's had been to him and to many others. Mr. Villiers was later knighted and was popularly referred to as Sir Thomas Villiers. The building work progressed steadily, and by St. Michael's Day in 1922, the whole church was completed, including the nave. A writer in the Ceylon Churchman said, "The new church is a culmination not only of generosity and devotion of the present congregation and workers, but of the labor and prayers and love of so many who during the past 50 years have worked for and looked forward to the time when the people of St. Michael's and the people of Colombo should meet for worship, prayer, and praise in the building, worthy of him for whose glory and in whose service it was erected. St. Michael's and All Angels Colombo is a noble heritage, and it's the joy and responsibility of the present generation to hand it down enriched and unimpaired. The architecture of the church has been admired by all those who have had the opportunity of worshiping it. Father Ricketts was able to gather the support of high and low, rich and poor in all his work at St. Michael's. He organized the choir, which is said to have been the finest choirs in Ceylon. Men from every walk of life were on the waiting list to join the choir. And so it was with the servers. Even in the 1950s, wanted to serve in the Lady Chapel, including me, for at least 1 year before I got a chance to serve in the high altar.
How did you feel about it?
Well, there were so many willing to come forward. And I came into St. Michael's with a connection with Father Amenaka, who had been my boarding master at Badunda. He invited me to start serving again. And so he said, the tradition has been that you'll have to serve in the Lady Chapel before you get a chance. And that was the case for many of us. Many of us who worship here Sunday after Sunday do not realize the beauty and the inspiration that the church offers us. We take so much for granted. A new person who enters the church would be overawed by the magnificence and the architectural beauty of the church. There is no other church in Sri Lanka with such architectural beauty and the many artifacts around. As we enter through the west door, we see the font on the left. Through baptism, we become members of the church. The font was a gift from Mr. A.H.D. Soiza. The main stained glass window of the church is in the west end. There are 3 arched windows cut deep into the walls. Featured here are 3 of the best stained glass windows in Sri Lanka. The stained glass portray the 3 archangels of God, with St. Michael's taking the center place and flanked by Gabriel and Raphael. When you look up at the timber ceiling, one wonders where they got all this precious timber which we need to care for. The broad nave, the body of the church, represents the church merited. The entire nave was funded by Sir Thomas Villiers. As you come up, you will notice the beautiful arches. Arches are part of the architectural beauty of our church. Then we have 14 stations of the cross. These are traditional 14 stations. You see, there was a question on Anglicans don't believe in
statues,
worshipping idols.
Idols, yes.
So why are we having churches that statues in St. Michael's?
Correct.
You see, if you look at the 14 stations, they reflect the final journey of Jesus. His suffering, his journey through the 14 stages, which we go through during period of Lent. And they actually show us the real suffering that Jesus went through. And in each of these stations, we don't worship them, but they really give us a picture of what Jesus went through. And we reflect on those and what means to us today. That is what it is. We don't worship them. Similarly, with each of the other figurines that we have in the church, and I will come to them quietly. The pulpit is a donation from A.P. Baldock in memory of his wife. The pulpit is in the center of the church because in the early days, there was no sound system. So the pulpits were somewhere towards the middle. It is the same in many parts of the world. Up to Father Swithin's time, clergy preached from this pulpit. Towards the latter part of his term, he introduced the lectern, and he said that he needs to face the people to see them and to have eye contact. The lectern is a donation from Mr. E.N.E. Kure. It is very intricate work. There are some damages which we need to rectify. Now, on the left, at the top of the left side of the left aisle of the church, we have a chapel, which is known as St. Thomas's Chapel. We used to have services in Sinhala and Tamil in this chapel, while the English services were held in the Lady Chapel. Then we have the St. Michael statue. It's a gift from Beatrice Dias in memory of her elder sister, Gracie Peres. The chapel was funded by the sons and daughters of Jacob and Helena Nimel in memory of their parents. The large statue of Mary carrying infant Jesus at the entrance to the chapel is by a well-known sculptor, Sister Marable of the community of St. Mary the Virgin in Oxfordshire. Now, I need to go into a little more detail about this worshipping and idols in the church. You see, for the first 1,600 years of Christianity, most people could not read or write. Every stained glass window and statue in the early church told a story. The average person could not read and understand the stories in the Bible for themselves. Priests and scribes were the only people in the church in those days who were educated enough and were able to read and portray the stories in the Bible. The stories not only portrayed the stories of the Bible, and also what the people of those times looked like. For example, statue of Jesus on the cross could help us to remember the sacrifice of Jesus. We don't pray to them, but it's a source which to inspire us in our worship. Statues act as a virtual aid for worship. Statues are just a representation, like a picture to remind us of Jesus might have looked like, or what the angels would have looked like. It is not for us to adore the statues themselves, but just as a reminder to help us in our worship. Just as it helps us to remember one's mother by looking at a photograph. Then we come to the choir area. The chancel area is raised and is typical of the church triumphant in heaven. The high point of our church is a rare root beam or screen with its intricate carvings that span the chancel arch. This was funded by Mr. and Mrs. Watson Peres. Fixed on the center is a large-than-life wooden statue of Mary, the mother of Jesus, and St. John on either side. The ornate four endings of the crucifix frame are symbolic paintings of the four gospel writers. These symbols traditionally attributed to the authors of the four canonical gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These show Matthew as a winged man, Mark as a lion, Luke as an ox, and John as an eagle. At the foot of the cross are carvings of a pelican feeding our checks, a symbol of sacrifice. We would have also noticed plaques attached at equal spaces at the root beam. They are symbols associated with the sacrifice, passion, and death of Jesus. Somewhere in 1977, between 77 and 82, during Father James's period, termites attacked the wooden beam and the top of the cross fell down. Fortunately, no one was injured. Father James contacted Father Swithin, who was then the Archdeacon. He came down and brought down engineers from Walkers. The engineers came with their workmen, and they were all thinking around. I happened to be there. They were all planning as to how to bring down the statues, large than size statues. While they were talking quite some time, the workmen from the shipyard came with thick ropes. They came silently and they threw the ropes over the strong beams and then gradually brought down the statues one by one. And then the work making a new beam was entrusted to Mr. Jacob Fernando from Morotua. He did a good job, and it took some months, but it was done. The earlier beam was erected on wooden pillars right on both sides, but now we have concrete pillars so that hopefully termites won't attack. The pews in the choir stalls and the whole church are intricately carved. They are very heavy and should avoid shifting them for any events. The pipe organ was a gift from Thomas Villiers. He had promised the organ if his son returned from the war. Unfortunately, he did not. And Mr. Thomas in any way gifted the organ. The pipe organ is one of the largest in Asia. It is very precious. It was maintained by Mr. Constable at the early stages. After he passed away, Father Berard, a Roman Catholic priest, assisted. After he died, then Dr. Lalit, our great music director, took over. We thank God for all that Dr. Lalit did over the years to look after our organ. We miss him very much. You see, on my visit to London, India, some years ago, I did explore whether some of the technicians could come here and do it, but didn't work out because at that time it was the height of the LTD problems and he was scared to come. About 2 years ago, some Dutch experts came to Colombo to help the Dutch Reformed Church repair some of our organs. I managed to get in touch with them and brought the team to St. Michael's. They came, Father Lalit, Dr. Lalit was there. They looked at it. They said that they were very keen and they admired our organ and said it has to be looked after. They promised to come, but unfortunately, Mr. Rudy, the chief of the team, had some heart problems in 2019, Christmas time, and he had to undergo surgery. Then, of course, the virus lockdown, they're unable to come. But he was very keen to come. Hopefully, maybe someday his team would be able to come. Then, also I need to touch, time is running out. There's so much to say. I'll just tell about the 7 lights in the sanctuary. The high altar is of Roman stone and black marble. On either side of the altar, we see the intricately carved wooden screen holding 12 icon paintings of archangels and saints. On the high altar, the arches open to unglazed window. I'm not going to touch on that right now. But in the altar, as you enter, you see the 7 red lights, which actually represent the 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit. We might have taken it for granted, as they decorate the high altar. Actually, they represent the gifts of the 7 Holy Spirit. They represent wisdom, understanding, counsel, ghostly strength, knowledge, true godliness, and holy fear. There is the heavily carved bishop's chair. There's so much meaning in it. I'm not going to go into it. Father Ricketts left Ceylon in 1922. Again, he went on to become a bishop in England. Father Ricketts was succeeded by Reverend Foster, who arrived from England. St. Michael's in the early days, even now, holds the position of being the premier church in the diocese for Catholic tradition. From Archdeacon Matthew to Ricketts, all the vicars were all members of the Tractarian movement and believed and taught in the Catholic faith as it came down from the fathers. Father Foster brought down a new tradition into being, for he was the pioneer in St. Michael's of what was known as the Catholic movement in the Church of England. Father Foster introduced the regular children's Eucharist at St. Michael's, the use of incense at sung Mass, and the extra liturgical service of devotions on Saturday evenings. High Mass became a regular feature at St. Michael's during the time. Unfortunately, we don't have High Mass anymore. Meanwhile, worship in Tamil was begun at St. Michael's. Here again, we do not know exactly when it began, but by 1926, The Tamil congregation is said to have increased to such an extent that it was considered to appoint a Tamil priest. The Reverend S.H.W. Ramanathan, who later became a canon, was appointed to look after the Tamil congregation. In the early days, St. Michael's worship was conducted in Sinhalese, English, and Portuguese. The service in Portuguese was dropped during Father Henley's time, when the language ceased to be spoken freely. Then once again, services were held in the three languages of our country. Sometimes the churches in other buildings are spoiled by amateur and uncoordinated plans of adornment devised by church officers due to perhaps inexperience or taste to see what was more fitting. Father Foster, realizing this, obtained skilled knowledge of experts from the country and abroad in accepting gifts for the church. It was during his time that we received some of the most beautiful ornaments that adorn St. Michael's today. The rood screen or beam, the lectern, the font, the east window in the Lady Chapel. Apart from this, there were many other gifts. Father Foster was actively involved in medical mission at Denipija in Mathura district. The mission was special care of St. Michael's, and its congregation supported its activities for many years. Manoj, it's almost time. There is so much more to say. All I can say is most of what I was planning to say is included in the history book, Story of St. Michael's, which we produced in 2012. Some copies of it are still available in the parish, and I think people interested could buy it from Malati in the parish office or James. They're priced at ₹100, and I'm sure many of you would be interested to look at the whole history of St. Michael's, which that book contains. It will take another 10-15 minutes for me to go through, but I'll stop there. Manoj.
Uncle, just a quick, can you give a small brief understanding about the Matthew Hall? Maybe it's a brief one, you don't have to go into many more details, but about the Matthew Hall, how did that start? Why did it start? Was it for the community or was it for the church?
You see, Matthew Hall, the old Matthew Hall had two parts. The main hall was one, the adjoining hall was used by the school. So when the school was taken over, the government wanted to take over the Matthew Hall as well as the school, the section that the school was using, and in fact took over. But during Father Swithin's time, he negotiated with the government. It took a long time. There were a lot of problems. There was protest from the school authorities. There were protests at, there you are, the old Matthew Hall. Thank you for that. And there were protests from the community who were running the school at that time and from the church for giving it. So ultimately Father Bishop, Father Swithin and Father Abhenayaka managed to negotiate with the government and ultimately came to an understanding that the school, that the government would give us back the Matthew Hall and the adjoining building if the church put up adequate space for the school, which they agreed. Originally, the wardens had said, it seems apparently, that they were willing to sort this out provided no compensation was necessary. But now it transpired, we had to put up a 3-story building for them. That is the building that you see there in the school premises. So the school, the church had to mortgage the vicarage, which was then at 54 Green Park, and then fund the building of Matthew Hall. So they gave the Matthew Hall, the original building, put up the building and gave it to Matthew Hall and took the Matthew Hall and adjoining building back to the church. And you see, there were a lot of problems. And in fact, at one stage, the community came and had a Pirit ceremony in the hall. You see, they started cooking in the parish hall, preventing the church from taking it over. And one day, Father Swithin is supposed to have gone there and said that for him also to be, food to be cooked for him also. After a day or two, they had vacated the place. So little issues, interesting ones, which you will read in the history of St. Michael's. So it's a great story how they took back the Matthew Hall. Of course, there was even Michaelites had gone and stood in front of Father Abhenayaka's house. And he said, how can you go and give over this church? You see, mostly members of the singular congregation. So I think ultimately it was explained. And there's a lot of story during Father Dulip's time, the starting of the team ministry. There's so much that we have to learn from. I think people have to look at this, get a copy of the history book and read it. It's all there in great detail. You see, we have to be very proud of what we did during Bishop Dulip's time. You see, we have worked with the refugees. We have worked with the southern insurgent students who were in the army. We negotiated with the army and worked out a training program for them to give them training in tailoring. We got some funding from the NCC, bought machines for them on the understanding at the end of the training period that they would be released. Of course, there again, there was protest in St. Michael's saying that we don't want to bring the insurgents into St. Michael's Hall. So Father Dilip negotiated with Kittu Savana and arranged to have the program there. And that is what happened. At the end of the program, we tied the 12 insurgents with members in the congregation to look after them for a couple of years, which was done, but that also ended abruptly. So please look at it, take a copy, study it, and learn what so much that St. Michael's has done over the years. Let me conclude by one thing. People who have gone before us, who have served at St. Michael's and gone to great heights in the church and outside. Let me just record. Bishop Lakdasa Dimel, first Bishop of Kurunagala and Metropolitan of the Church of India, Pakistan, Burma, and so on. Bishop, he was a server in the church. Bishop Araldi Soisa, server, Archdeacon and Bishop. Bishop Cyril Abenaik, Archdeacon and Bishop. Bishop Swithin Fernando, Archdeacon and Bishop. Bishop Jabez Nyanaprakasan, Archdeacon and Bishop. Bishop Dulip Pichekera, Father Krishanta Mendis, Archdeacon, and now Father Dushanta Rodrigo, Bishop. In addition, we had priest Mr. Ilex Polonagam, who left at his death most of his assets to St. Michael's and St. Margaret's. S.P. Rajarat, Lionel Pires, and Maxwell Dobbs. There may be others I might have left out, but there is a great tradition of people who have grown into the ministry from the very early stages. Can I stop there, Manoj?
Thank you very much, Uncle. Thank you for all the history. I know it's not enough time. If anyone has a question or two, please go ahead. I can give about 6 minutes, I guess. We can stop at 7:10. If anyone has any general questions about the church.
You see, one other important event that took place was in 11th April 1954, when the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh attended Mass at St. Michael's. You see, in the early days, cathedral was not there, and most of the diocesan services used to be held in the cathedral. And so it was. Then in 1964, Bishop Harold was consecrated at St. Michael's. His last wish had been that St. Michael should be his resting place before his burial. Then in 1958, Ilex Polonagam, who was a layman, chaired the AGM of the English congregation when all three priests were indisposed. First time and the only time in the history of the Church of Ceylon a layman chaired the meeting. Most of the bishops have taken their oath of canonical obedience in St. Michael's. You see, so these are great events that have taken place in St. Michael's, and we are proud of them. And I think earlier I missed out the bishop's chair, which is very intricate, and where most of the local birds, in plants, and all that type were included. You see, local indigenization. And when it comes to indigenization, St. Michael's was in the forefront. First time, the drums were used at St. Michael's. First time, for a ceremony, a wedding was informed at St. Michael's. There are so many other events that have taken place at St. Michael's, which no other church would have experimented it in the early days. And we are grateful for people. There was Surya Sena. You see, he whose pioneering effort in producing a setting for the liturgy in Sinhala has left a lasting influence. You see, in indigenization of faith and worship led others to embark on frontier missions, such as Devasarana Ramaya by Father Yogan Devananda, and the Christian Workers Fellowship by Vidyasagar. The use of drums, the use of Nadaswaram. You see, the first woman priest to celebrate the Eucharist was at St. Michael's, Reverend June Muffin from Calcutta. So a lot of pioneering efforts have taken place at St. Michael's, and I think we should be bold enough to continue to walk in that direction.
Yes.
Thank you.
Uncle Russell has a question.
Yeah.
You're on mute, Uncle.
Yeah.
Uncle Russell, you're on mute. You have to unmute yourself. Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Paul, for that very informative lecture. I fortunately have a copy of the history of St. Michael.
Good.
A bit bottled by various insects, but still survives. Paul, just one question, or two questions. One is, do we have any record of who the architect was and who did the actual construction? I mean, was it, at that time there were many British firms in the country, British engineering firms. So do we have any record of that?
All we have is a record that the plans were drawn up by Mr. Hubert Walker, ARIBA. I don't know what it stands for.
No, that is the Royal Institute of British Architects.
Okay. He who had been a long-standing worshipper at St. Michael's.
Right.
You see? Now, strong people at that time at St. Michael's leading figures would have been Archdeacon Matthew and the priests who were then, plus particularly Mr. Thomas Billiers, who was later a knight and who was also a chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, a leading businessman. So I think there would have been a team of leading Europeans who took the whole thing through. Right. Unfortunately, both are right. I've also gone to the Lake House archives to see whether any publications in newspapers, some of them, whatever that was available, I have taken. Even in the diocesan office archives, there's nothing much available. And in fact, I've also tried to see whether we can get a copy of the architectural drawings from the municipality.
Oh, yeah,
we
exactly.
have not succeeded so far, but we are working on it. Yeah. But it will be interesting. Lot of information, particularly of the earlier stages, not available anywhere. Unfortunately, they are not documented. And unfortunately, people are not around now. I remember talking to Tom Navaratnam at the earlier stages, and trying to get some information before he migrated to New Zealand and all, sitting with him and finding, never got down to it. And in fact, I told Tom, we will even engage the services of a stenographer, start writing down whatever you know, but it never happened. So that is why I made it a point to see whatever I could gather. I got it from this magazine, try to put it.
No, I think that's a great, we must refresh our memories with that, reading to that again. Just one other thing, Paul, you said that, this St. Michael's or St. Thomas's, it served the community here. But wasn't Christ's Ballfest, which is in the same area, didn't it predate St. Michael's? Or St.
Yes, the present church, yes. It was Christ Church was built up earlier, and Christ Church did, in fact, they catered to a wide variety of people from different races. You see, the Dutch, the British, the Indians, all these people, In fact, most of the seafarers used to go to Galways. But unfortunately, apparently at that time when Archdeacon Matthew was thinking of St. Michael's, they felt that St. Michael, Christchurch was too small, limited accommodation.
Yeah, yeah.
So they concentrated heavily on building up St. Michael's. So Christchurch has a history of its own.
Yeah, there was a nice article like that appeared in some foreign journal about Christchurch.
Yeah, that's right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Russell, for that.
Any other questions? Yeah,
Well, I also wish to thank Mr. Paul Raj for coming forward to make this presentation. I'm sorry I joined in at the last moment because I had to attend the ordination that was held at the cathedral. But I'm happy to hear what you are sharing. I know Mr. Paul Raj has a lot to share. Manoj, maybe if we could actually take little sections a day, I think we'll be able to go into more details. And it's all interesting especially for people who are interested in history, to go into all these little details.
It's a good suggestion.
Yeah.
We can go into section by section, so we can have a dialogue and go into it. It's a good suggestion. Yeah.
And I can see Father
Thank you very much,
Krishnanta is also. Yeah, I can see Father Krishnanta is also here, Father. So maybe we can slowly pull him also into it.
Thank you, Manoj, for
okay. Thank you very much, Uncle. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you everyone for joining. Okay.